Here's a story you've probably barely heard anything about. The Guardian says here, Saudi-led coalition strike kills at least 20 at wedding in Yemen. I've seen a few articles on this, mostly foreign outlets like The Guardian. Barely a blip in the radar. Now remember, they were telling us that we're so concerned with the deaths of civilians that we had to intervene in Syria and bomb what they said was a chemical weapons facility. It turns out it wasn't a chemical weapons facility. But now you have a situation where civilians are dying and they were bombed at a wedding with weapons we gave Saudi Arabia. And weird, where are all the humanitarian interveners? Where are they? I don't hear anything from them now. Nobody's talking about bombing somebody. Nobody's talking about we have to intervene. You know, now it's silence virtually across the board. An airstrike by the Saudi-led coalition hit a wedding party in northern Yemen, killing at least 20 people, health officials said, as harrowing images emerged on social media of the deadly bombing, the third to hit Yemeni civilians since the weekend. Khaled al-Nadhri, the top health official in the northern province of Hajja, told the Associated Press that most of the dead were women and children who were gathered in one of the tents set up for the wedding party in the district of Bani Qayis. He said the bride was among the dead. The hospital chief, Mohammed al-Somali, said the groom and 45 of the wounded were brought to the local hospital. Health authorities appealed for people to donate blood. Ali Nasser al-Azib, the deputy head of Al-Jamuri Hospital, said 30 children were among the wounded, some in critical condition with shrapnel wounds and severed limbs. Footage that emerged from the scene of the airstrike shows scattered body parts and a young boy in a green shirt hugging a man's lifeless body, screaming and crying. Health Ministry spokesman Abdel Hakim Al-Kalan said ambulances were initially unable to reach the site of the bombing for fear of subsequent airstrikes as the jets continued to fly overhead after the initial strike. So that's what's called a double tap. And that's something that the U.S. has engaged in often, and that's something that now Saudi Arabia is engaging in. And the idea of the double tap is pretty self-explanatory. You bomb somebody that you think are extremists. In this case, they weren't, but who cares? And then you circle back around when the first responders show up, and you attack the first responders. Which, by the way, there's a term for that. It's called terrorism. Because usually when they're first responders, they're what? Medical people. They're civilians who are helping. And when you target them on purpose, that's terrorism. You're targeting civilians on purpose for a political reason. So we engage in that all the time. Saudi Arabia engages in that all the time. So much so they were afraid to go to the wedding that was just bombed to help people because they knew they would get blown up again. Imagine going to your wedding and your wife dies and you're wounded. And there are 30 children, some with severed limbs, hurt, at least 20 people dead. Just imagine that for a second. Just imagine that. And that's what our weapons are doing. And one of our top allies are doing it. In fact, the people who sit on the Human Rights Council at the UN, Saudi Arabia, they're the ones who are doing it. So listen, you know what? Propaganda is not just about what's covered. It's about what's omitted and not covered. So you go back to everything happening in Syria. Whenever anything happens, you get week-long coverage and everybody's hair's on fire, and you get Republicans and nominal Democrats in the media prodding the president to do something. See, that's propaganda. Not just because they're covering that issue and they're taking a strong stance in favor of intervention, but also because they're not giving you the total picture. Because they're pretending like all they're concerned about, hey, we're objective here in the media. We just care about human lives. That's what we're doing here. That's why we care. Really? I've seen you do no segments on the Congo. I've seen you do no segments on South Sudan. I've seen you do no segments on the genocide in Myanmar against Rohingya Muslims. So it looks like wherever your humanitarian concern lies just happens to coincide with where the State Department wants to intervene militarily and do regime change. Weird. And then, listen, here's the most important takeaway from this. Like I said, Propaganda is also about what's not covered. This is not getting nearly as much coverage as anything that happens in Syria. Okay, mostly foreign outlets are reporting on it, barely a blip on the 24-hour news networks in the U.S., CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. And the takeaway here is, you know what the U.S. is responsible for? We're responsible for our own actions. So Noam Chomsky's famous quote that I bring up all the time is, there's an easy way to stop terrorism. Stop participating in it. So in other words, all the fake humanitarian busybodies in the U.S. always want to do humanitarian intervention to go bomb somebody else for some wrongdoing they allegedly did. They never say, hey, we're responsible for our own actions. We're not responsible for the bad actions of some tin pot foreign dictator. We're responsible for our own actions. So if you abide by that principle, what happens? Thing number one you do is stop dumping all these arms into the Middle East. You stop arming Israel, which is a permanent apartheid state and doing illegal occupation and massacring Palestinians on a regular basis. You stop arming Egypt, for example, brutal dictatorship. You stop arming Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, you know, one of the most extremist governments that there is in the world today, and they're committing a genocide in Yemen. Remember, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, they've bombed hospitals. They've bombed schools. They've bombed mosques. They've bombed open-air markets. They've bombed multiple weddings. We've bombed weddings with drones. They're also blockading the country, so a lot of food isn't getting in. Medicine's not getting in. As a result of that, 3 million people are displaced. There's a cholera outbreak that's devastating the country. So all these huge problems, all of it, could be stopped if we just stopped arming Saudi Arabia and stopped partaking in the genocide. But all the people who cry their crocodile tears over civilians that happen to be allegedly hurt in the places where we want to do regime change, they're nowhere to be found for this. Because when we do it, it's justified by definition. And when our ally does it, mum's the word because they mean well or something. Even if they don't, well, they mean well or something, so just shut the fuck up about that. We're not going to shut the fuck up about that. Because like I said, we're responsible for our own actions. We're responsible for what we do. So if you want to stop terrorism, stop with the fucking drone strikes. There's been over 400% increase in drone strikes under Trump. Trump's already surpassed Obama's civilian deaths in drone strikes already. 8 years versus a little over a year. Already surpassed it. Pull out of the 8 countries that we're currently in right now, which would cut back on civilian deaths. And stop arming all these brutal regimes all over the Middle East. Stop arming jihadist rebels. If you want to affect the world in a positive way, you do that. But doing that would require us to look in the mirror and understand that we're responsible for what we do. And the media will do everything but that.